Wow. I really like equality.
Yeah, equality for women, equality for blacks,
Equality for marriage.
equality for all races, actually.
Yeah. Hey, do you guys know anything about 1960s? No. Well, come on over to my 2007 Ford station wagon, and I'll show you. Let's go!
Going on a ride of knowledge. Beep, boop, 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 boop. Going back in time to the 1960s, everyone. 1960s kind of started out with an embarrassment for the United States.
What was that, Rachel?
It was the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs was an American attempt to overthrow the newly established government in Cuba by trading and sending Cuban rebels. The coup ended up in a disaster due to the lack of support by the Americans. The incident was an embarrassment for the United States and ultimately led Castro pleading for Soviet aid. This also led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was an incident where the Soviet missiles were placed in Cuba as a response for help. The event greatly increased tension between the Soviets and the Americans. As a result, a hotline was established between the two nations to avoid any accidents. Another disaster in the 1960s was Vietnam. Vietnam was originally a French colony, but was lost in World War I. Ho Chi Minh, fiery pro-communist, launches a nationalistic movement and declares Vietnam an independent nation. Ho Chi Minh begs Truman to recognize Vietnam and not let the French reclaim them, asking him to remember how his own country, America, came to be. When the French president de Gaulle asserts that he will no longer support the U.S. if they interfere with the return of Vietnam as a French colony, Truman quietly sides with de Gaulle, leaving the Vietnamese seething in betrayal. When the French actually entered Vietnam, they face a nasty, hostile situation, are eventually forced to surrender. A ceasefire is settled at the Geneva Convention of '64. Vietnam is divided, and Ho Chi Minh sits in the north with Ngo Dinh Diem south. Domino theory arises, and U.S. becomes convinced that they must support South Vietnamese or risk the entirety of Asia. Low-intensity warfare with the Green Berets, as well as training the South Vietnamese military, eventually deposes Diem, resulting in much bad press. Numbers of men deployed to Vietnam escalates immensely by the time Kennedy is assassinated. In 1963, Kennedy was assassinated. Did you guys know this?
What?
There was a bunch of assassinations in the 1960s.
Like who?
Kennedy being one of the biggest. He was riding in a parade to drum up support for the upcoming presidential election in 1964. JFK was shot not once, but twice by Lee Harvey Oswald and pronounced dead at Parkland Hospital. When Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson took over as president. Johnson demanded an end to poverty and racial injustice, promising to carry on JFK's legacy, but wanting to add in his own plans and ideas. He was bent on fixing the inequalities of U.S. society and planned to end segregation along with other racial injustices. He wanted to secure a reputation like that of FDR with a similar New Deal kind of structure. This is what Johnson wanted to be known and remembered for, but instead he was stuck with the Vietnam War, which ended up taking all of his time. So he was unable to pursue his great society to any extent. So then there was the 1964 presidential election between Johnson and Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater preached low taxes and less federal government intrusion, which was the classic conservative agenda. Vietnam was a major issue on the agenda. Republicans believed that low-intensity warfare needed to be scrapped with an all-in or not at all mentality. Johnson, on the other hand, promised not to expand the war. He didn't want to lose Vietnam like Truman lost China. So while he was promising not to expand, he was privately planning to escalate the war in order to end it swift and fast. So basically Nixon won the 1964 presidential election.
Nixon.
In light of the anti-war sentiment and backlash he was getting, he decided to abandon his hard criticism of the communists and initiates his secret plan to end the Vietnam War. He must appeal to the silent majority, the hard-working middle class who don't have time to protest but adamantly demands law and order and peace with honor. The presidential campaign between the Democratic nominee, Robert Kennedy, who wanted to extend civil rights and end the war through negotiation, and Nixon, the Republican, was the most powerful of the two. And the Robert F. Kennedy assassination. Saran Surratt. Is that his both? Does he have two names? Is that his real name? Surratt greeted him with 6 shots in point-blank range. Kennedy's body was put on a train and paraded across the country for the people to pay their respects. The assassination was part of the decimation of the Democratic Party, along with the chaos in the Democratic Convention, making the people turn to Nixon.
Civil rights were a big problem back in the 1960s. Blacks were fighting for civil rights along with other races. Some of the most notable are the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act banned discrimination that was based on race, color, religion, sex, or nationality in the employment practices. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 also ended racial segregation in schools, workplaces, and public buildings. Some of the other acts that were involved with these civil rights are the Voting Rights Act, that was in 1965, and this protected or restored the voting rights of minorities with federal oversight of the registration and election process in areas where racial discrimination and voting was very common. Also, the Fair Housing Act in 1968, this banned discrimination when in the process of renting or buying a house. Because the blacks were fighting for their civil rights, this resulted in many riots and uprisings throughout the country. So, the SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, formed to empower ordinary blacks to fight for their civil rights and the decisions that were made to control their lives by the government. The Greensboro sit-in was a bunch of college students that sat at a lunch counter reserved for whites for 5 months, and this initiated protests across the country. So during the spring of 1963, this was the peak of protests across the country. There was about 15,000 arrests in 186 different cities. And in Birmingham, Alabama was the most notable of these. It was a very racially violent city, and they would bomb blacks' houses and institutions very commonly. Martin Luther King Jr., we all know him, what a man. He wrote the letter from Birmingham jail while he was in Birmingham jail. He made the big decision to put a bunch of black school children in the streets of Birmingham for a protest. The police unleashed all their forces on these thousands of school children, and then it was broadcasted on TV. They would assault them with fire hoses, attack dogs, and nightsticks.
Speaking of all this protesting, since we're in the 1960s, there's a protest going outside right now.
Let's go join them!
Yeah, I have posters right here.
Wonderful!
Love, not war.
Equal rights for all!
End racism.
Let's go!
Go. Equal rights for all.
End racism!
Equal rights. Another major protest that happened during the 1960s were the Stonewall riots that happened in New York. Just after 3 a.m., a police raid of the Stonewall Inn, a gay club located on New York City's Christopher Street, turns violent. These riots were based on the Gay Liberation Front, as well as other gay, lesbian, and bisexual civil rights organizations.
The 1960s was a time for major environmental awareness. So the publishing of the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson raised awareness of insecticides, such as DDT, that were polluting the environment. The Sierra Club, which was originally founded in the 1890s, was about forest preservation. And after the Silent Spring book was published, the membership more than tripled. After Silent Spring was published, more groups started to pop up around the country that were warning the public about the dangers of water contamination, lead paint, and air pollution, and also the fact that a bunch of animals were going extinct.
Part of the pop culture of the 1960s, in 1969 there was a Woodstock Music and Art Fair that took place in August 15th through the 17th. Woodstock was described as an Aquarian exposition, 3 days of peace and music.
You know what the people in the 1960s really wanted? Respect!